The day my life started unraveling seemed ordinary enough. I was sitting at our kitchen table, staring at the rays of sunlight streaking through the blinds, sipping coffee that had gone cold hours ago. My wife, Emily, had always been a creature of habit. Each morning, she'd grab her purse and say the same words with a smile. "I'm off to work. Don't wait up too late for me." But that smile had begun to change. It was subtle at first, missing the usual warmth, replaced by something distant, rehearsed. I convinced myself it was stress. After all, the restaurant she frequented for lunch had become something of her sanctuary. She loved the ambience, the staff, and especially the waiter, Daniel. He was her favorite. It wasn't jealousy that first raised the alarm. No, it was something else entirely. Small signs that added up in a way I couldn't ignore. The extra care she took in her appearance before lunch with friends, the text messages that made her eyes light up as if the words on the screen were oxygen and she had been holding her breath. I didn't know it yet, but I was standing on the edge of a chasm, ready to fall. The tea started with a receipt I found crumpled at the bottom of our kitchen trash can. Most of the ink had faded, but the timestamp was clear, 9:47 p.m. It was from her favorite restaurant, the one she'd claimed to have gone to for lunch. I stood there, staring at the receipt, turning it over in my hands, willing it to make sense. Emily wasn't home yet, though it was nearly 10 p.m. Her texts had been sporadic that day, a simple busy at work. Might grab dinner with Susan around 6, followed by radio silence. My gut told me something wasn't right, but I stuffed the thought down and tried to focus on other things. I convinced myself I was being paranoid. When she finally came through the door, there was an unfamiliar scent clinging to her, a faint mix of cologne and expensive wine. "Susan and I tried that new French place downtown," she said casually, kicking off her heels. I wanted to believe her, but the nagging voice in my head wouldn't let me. Later that night, when she was asleep, I checked her phone. I hated myself for it, but I had to know. Most of her messages seemed normal, but one caught my eye, a thread with someone saved as Dan. The last text read, "See you tomorrow at the usual spot. Can't wait." My heart sank, but I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just a friend. Maybe it was nothing. But deep down, I knew better. The next day, I couldn't focus on anything. I kept replaying the text in my mind, trying to decipher what usual spot meant. My thoughts bounced between denial and dread, but one thing was clear. I needed answers. Emily left that morning with the same breezy, distracted smile she always wore lately. "Don't forget to pick up milk," she called over her shoulder as she grabbed her bag and walked out the door. I didn't respond. Instead, I waited 5 minutes before grabbing my keys and following her. I told myself I wasn't a jealous man, just a curious one. I just needed to know the truth. Her car weaved through the streets of our city, finally pulling into the parking lot of her favorite restaurant. I parked a safe distance away and watched as she stepped out, smoothing her skirt. She walked inside with a lightness I hadn't seen in months. My chest tightened as I considered the possibility that her joy came from someone else. 15 minutes passed, then 20. Finally, I stepped out of my car and approached the restaurant, peeking through the large glass windows. That's when I saw them, Emily and Daniel, the waiter she always spoke so fondly of. He was sitting across from her at a corner table, leaning in close as she laughed at something he said. It wasn't a casual laugh. It was the kind that lit up her face, the kind I hadn't been able to pull from her in ages. I stood frozen, my world tilting on its axis. This wasn't just lunch. It was intimate, unguarded, the kind of connection that I thought was reserved for us. My first instinct was to storm in and confront them, but something held me back. Instead, I walked away, my mind racing. I needed more than just a fleeting glimpse to make sense of what I'd seen. I didn't go home right away. Instead, I drove around the city, aimlessly at first, trying to calm the storm of emotions that were tearing through me. The roads blurred as I thought of all the little things I had missed, the late nights at the office, the way her eyes would sometimes flicker away from mine when I asked about her day, the long, lingering silences that used to be filled with our laughter and shared moments. All of it suddenly made sense in a way it hadn't before. After what felt like hours, I found myself in front of the house. My hands were shaking as I pulled into the driveway, unsure of what I was even going to say when I saw her. The weight of what I had just seen felt like a lead weight in my chest, suffocating me, but I knew I couldn't let it go any longer. I had to confront her. I walked through the front door, trying to gather my thoughts, but the moment I stepped inside, I was hit with the smell of her perfume, something floral and sweet, too sweet. I stood there in the foyer, my mind racing as I thought of all the possible scenarios, how she might lie, how she might deny it, how she would beg for my forgiveness. But the worst part was knowing that no matter what she said, it wouldn't undo what I had seen. Emily was in the kitchen, her back turned as she poured herself a glass of wine. She seemed calm, almost too calm. I didn't know what I was expecting, but it certainly wasn't this. She turned around when she heard me and smiled in that way that used to melt my heart. But now, it felt fake. I couldn't bring myself to return the smile. "Hey, you're home early," she said, taking a sip from her glass. "Yeah, I was out for a while," I said, trying to sound normal. "I saw you at lunch." Her face froze. Her smile faltered, just slightly, but I saw it. I knew then that she had been expecting this. "Do you know who I saw you with?" I asked, my voice quieter than I intended, but filled with an anger I couldn't mask. Her eyes flicked to the floor. "John, please, let's talk about this calmly. You're misunderstanding." "Don't," I cut her off, unable to keep my voice steady anymore. "I saw you with him. Daniel, you think I didn't notice the way you were laughing? The way he was looking at you?" My throat tightened as I tried to hold back the flood of emotions, threatening to spill over. "You've been lying to me, Emily. How long has this been going on? How many times have you seen him behind my back?" She didn't answer right away, and in that silence, I felt my heart break all over again. She couldn't even deny it. "I'm sorry, okay?" she said, finally looking up, her eyes red. "I never wanted to hurt you. It just happened." I couldn't believe it. "It just happened? Is that your excuse?" "John, she shook her head, as though struggling to find the right words, but I wasn't going to give her the chance. The truth had already settled in, and nothing she said could change it now. "What did he give you that I didn't?" I asked, the words slipping out before I could stop them. What did I do wrong? Was I not enough? Was I not exciting enough? She wiped away a tear and stepped toward me, her voice trembling. "It wasn't like that, I swear. It wasn't about you. I've just been feeling lost lately. I didn't know how to talk to you about it." "Don't you dare make this about you," I spat. "You made a choice, Emily. You made a choice to lie, to betray me, to let him into our lives. You chose him. So don't stand there and tell me it's not about me." She recoiled at my words, but I didn't care. The anger had taken over, and I was done pretending. For the first time in years, I realized that I had no idea who the woman standing in front of me was anymore. The woman I had married, the woman I had trusted with everything, had slipped away, replaced by someone I couldn't recognize. I didn't sleep that night. Emily tried to explain herself, tried to justify the unjustifiable, but her words were like static. I didn't hear them. All I could focus on was the image of her with Daniel, the way she smiled at him, the way her face lit up in a way it hadn't for me in years. By the time the clock hit 3 a.m., I was sitting in the living room, staring at nothing, my thoughts a blur of anger, sadness, and something else, something darker. She had betrayed me in the worst way possible. The woman I had loved and built a life with had made me a stranger in my own marriage. The more I thought about it, the more I realized I couldn't let this slide. I wouldn't just sit back and let her walk all over me. If she thought she could destroy my world without consequences, she was wrong. I was done being the passive, forgiving husband. I was done being her safety net. By the time the sun began to rise, I had made up my mind. I needed to gather proof. I needed to be smart about this. Storming into that restaurant and confronting Daniel might have given me temporary satisfaction, but it wouldn't change anything. I needed to hit her where it hurt, her reputation, her sense of control, her relationship with him. I didn't know exactly how I would do it yet, but the wheels were already turning. The next day, while Emily went about her routine as if nothing had happened, I started putting my plan into motion. I told her I needed some time to cool off, and she didn't argue. In fact, She seemed relieved. She probably thought I was retreating, that I'd eventually forgive her like so many others might. But she underestimated me. I started with her phone. While she was in the shower, I unlocked it using the passcode I'd memorized years ago. The thread with Daniel was still there, filled with messages that made my blood boil. He called her beautiful and baby. She told him she missed him, that she couldn't wait to see him again. Each word felt like a dagger, but I forced myself to keep reading, screenshotting everything as I went. I needed this. Next, I installed a small tracking app on her phone. It was simple enough, a program designed for parents to monitor their kids. Emily wouldn't even notice it. With it, I could track her location, see her messages, and even access her call logs. If she was going to lie to me, I was going to make sure I stayed one step ahead. By the time she got out of the shower, her phone was back on the counter, exactly where she'd left it. She smiled at me as if nothing had happened, and I smiled back, playing my part. That afternoon, I made another move. I went to the restaurant where Daniel worked. I didn't confront him. I wasn't ready for that yet, but I watched him from a corner table, noting the way he interacted with customers, the easy charm he exuded. He was good-looking, younger than me, and confident. But there was something else about him, something arrogant. He carried himself like a man who thought he could get away with anything. I left after an hour, unnoticed. As I walked to my car, I felt a strange sense of clarity. This wasn't just about Emily and Daniel anymore. This was about me reclaiming my life, my dignity, my power. They had made me feel small, but I wasn't going to stay that way. If they thought I was just going to let this slide, they had no idea what was coming. The next few days felt like walking a tightrope over a pit of fire. Emily continued acting as if nothing was wrong, as if the confrontation we had was just a momentary hiccup in our marriage. She played her part well, too well, but I wasn't the same person anymore. Every smile she gave me, every casual word she said, felt like a lie, a mask she wore to hide the truth. I was no longer interested in hearing her excuses or watching her fake remorse. I wanted answers. I wanted the full scope of her betrayal, and I was determined to uncover every sordid detail. The tracking app one installed was already proving its worth. Each time she left the house, I could see where she went. Most of her movements were routine. Work, errands, the occasional stop at her gym. But then came the detour. 2 days after I'd installed the app, she went back to the restaurant during her lunch break. Not with coworkers, not for a casual meal. No, she went to see him. The app showed her location hovering at the same place for over an hour. I clenched my fists as I stared at the screen. She hadn't even tried to hide it. The audacity of it all was infuriating. That evening, I went through her laptop while she was in the shower. It wasn't locked, a small mercy. I scoured her emails, her browser history, anything that might give me a clearer picture of what was happening. And then I found it, a folder tucked away in a random subfolder, cleverly named Work Receipts. Inside were photos. Photos of her and Daniel. They weren't explicit, but they didn't need to be. One showed them sitting together at what looked like a park, his arm casually draped around her shoulders. Another showed them walking hand in hand through the city. My chest tightened as I clicked through each image, the reality of her affair hitting me like a sledgehammer. But it was the messages I found that truly shattered whatever remnants of hope I might have been clinging to. Saved drafts in her email, probably meant to be sent later, filled with words she had never said to me. You make me feel alive again. I've never felt this way with anyone before. Each one was like a blow to the gut, a reminder that she had chosen him over me, that our marriage was nothing more than a hollow shell. That night, I barely spoke to her. She asked if I was okay, if I wanted to talk, but I just shook my head and said I was tired. In truth, I was planning my next move. It wasn't enough to know what was happening. I needed evidence, something irrefutable, something that would ensure she couldn't worm her way out of this when the time came to confront her again. I reached out to a private investigator the next morning, someone discreet and highly recommended. Within an hour, we had a meeting set up. I handed over the screenshots, the photos, the messages. He nodded as I explained everything, his expression calm but sympathetic. This is more common than you'd think, he said. Don't worry. We'll get you everything you need. As I left his office, I felt a strange mix of emotions. Anger, sadness, betrayal. They were all still there, swirling in my chest. But beneath it all was a flicker of something else. Determination. Emily and Daniel had underestimated me. They thought I would roll over, that I would accept this humiliation without a fight. They couldn't have been more wrong. The private investigator worked quickly. By the end of the first week, he handed me a folder filled with evidence, the weight of it heavier than I'd expected. Inside were photographs, detailed logs of her movements, and even a transcript of a conversation between Emily and Daniel recorded during one of their meetings. The photos were like knives to the heart. There they were, sitting at an outdoor cafe, her hand resting on his, her face illuminated with a smile I hadn't seen in years. Another showed them walking into a hotel, heads close together, oblivious to the world around them. The timestamps told the story. Long lunches, late-night meetups, and everything in between. But it was the transcript that broke me. "I can't keep pretending with him," Emily's voice said, her words clear despite the background noise of clinking glasses. "Every time I go home, I feel like I'm suffocating." "You don't have to pretend anymore," Daniel replied. "We can figure this out. You deserve to be happy." "And what about him?" she asked, though there wasn't much hesitation in her tone. Daniel laughed. "He'll survive. Guys like him always do. He's too boring to fall apart." Boring. That word echoed in my mind long after I'd closed the folder. Was that how she saw me? A placeholder, someone safe and predictable until she found something better? The thought made my blood boil. I spent the next day staring at that folder, my emotions shifting between rage and despair. But as the hours passed, a new feeling began to take root: resolve. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about justice. About ensuring that Emily and Daniel faced the consequences of their actions. That evening, Emily came home late again. She breezed through the door with a flimsy excuse about a last-minute meeting, her voice light, almost cheerful. It was like she didn't even care that I might have caught on. She kissed me on the cheek as though everything was normal and disappeared into the bedroom. I followed her, my heart pounding as I rehearsed the words in my head. But when I reached the doorway, I stopped. Not yet. This wasn't the moment. I needed to be patient, to wait for the perfect opportunity to confront her with the truth. Instead, I went to my office and began formulating a plan. I started with the finances, quietly opening a separate account and transferring funds into it bit by bit. I didn't know what the endgame would be, but I wanted to be prepared for anything. I also began documenting everything. Every text, every lie, every late-night absence. I wanted a record of her betrayal, something she couldn't deny when the time came. It wasn't just about catching her in the act anymore. It was about reclaiming control over my life. By the end of the night, I felt a sense of clarity I hadn't experienced in weeks. The truth was out there now, laid bare in black and white. And while it hurt more than I could have imagined, it also gave me the power to act. Emily might have thought she was untouchable, that her secrets would stay hidden forever. But she was wrong. And soon, she'd know just how wrong she was. The days that followed were a haze of calculated movements and simmering tension. Emily continued her charade, oblivious to the fact that I knew everything. Each time she left the house, I tracked her through the app. Each time her phone buzzed with a message, I read it moments later. Her double life was unraveling before her eyes, and she didn't even know it. The private investigator called me one afternoon with an update. "You might want to sit down for this," he said, his voice tinged with an urgency that made my stomach churn. "What is it?" I asked, gripping the phone tightly. "We found something unexpected. It's not just Daniel. She's been seeing another man too." His words hit me like a punch to the gut. "Another man?" I echoed, my voice barely above a whisper. "Yes. His name is Eric. He's older, married, and based out of another city. They meet when she claims to be on work trips." The air felt thick as I tried to process what he was saying. One betrayal had been devastating enough. But this? It was a web of deceit so tangled, I could barely keep track. My marriage had become a farce, a hollow shell built on lies. The investigator continued, "We've got evidence, photos, messages, the works. Do you want me to include it in the report?" "Yes," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "I want everything." That night, I couldn't bring myself to look at Emily. She was sitting on the couch, scrolling through her phone, completely at ease. I wondered how she could live with herself, knowing what she was doing. Did she even feel guilty? Or had she justified her actions to the point where she believed she was in the right? As I sat across from her, a dangerous thought entered my mind. What if I confronted Eric? What if I forced him to face what he'd done? But I quickly dismissed the idea. This wasn't about him, or even Daniel. This was about her. She was the one who had made vows to me. She was the one who had betrayed them. The next morning, I called the private investigator again. Can you dig into Eric's life? I asked. I need to know who he is, what he stands to lose. Already on it, he replied. I'll have a full report for you by the end of the week. That day, Emily left for one of her work trips. I tracked her to a hotel just outside the city and watched from my car as she checked in. Moments later, a man, presumably Eric, arrived. They embraced in the lobby before disappearing into the elevator. I stayed in my car for hours, my anger bubbling just beneath the surface. Part of me wanted to burst into that hotel room and confront them both. But I didn't. Not yet. Instead, I took pictures, documenting every moment. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about reclaiming my dignity and exposing the truth for everyone to see. The hours after seeing Emily with Eric were some of the longest of my life. I sat in my car outside the hotel, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. I felt like a man on the edge, caught between the urge to confront them and the need to play the long game. Every second that passed added another layer to my anger, but I forced myself to stay calm. Patience, I told myself. This isn't the moment. When Emily finally left the hotel, I watched her walk to her car, a soft smile playing on her lips. It was a smile I hadn't seen directed at me in months. She looked carefree, unburdened, as though what she'd done behind those hotel doors hadn't left a mark on her conscience. My heart twisted in a way I hadn't expected. I wasn't just angry, I was hurt. The woman I loved, the one I'd built a life with, was a stranger to me now. I stayed in my car until she drove off, the tail lights of her car disappearing into the night. Then, I left too. But instead of heading home, I drove to a quiet bar across town, a place where nobody would know me. I needed time to think, to plan my next move. Sitting at the bar with a whiskey in front of me, I replayed the events of the past few weeks in my mind. The lies, the texts, the photos. It was all so surreal. How had my life come to this? By the time I got home, it was well past midnight. The house was dark, silent, as though nothing was amiss. Emily's car was in the driveway, and the lights in our bedroom were off. I knew she was asleep, probably dreaming of Daniel or Eric, or whoever else might be in her orbit. I stood in the doorway of our bedroom for a moment, watching her. She looked peaceful, innocent even. But I knew better now. The next day, I began finalizing my plan. It wasn't enough to confront her. I wanted her to face the full weight of her actions. She had humiliated me, betrayed me, and broken our vows. She needed to understand the consequences of what she'd done. The private investigator came through with more information about Eric. He was married, with 2 grown children and a reputation to protect. I couldn't help but feel a grim satisfaction at the thought of exposing him. He wasn't innocent in all of this, and neither was Daniel. They had both played a part in tearing my life apart, and they wouldn't escape unscathed. Over the next few days, I gathered every piece of evidence I had: texts, photos, emails, and the investigator's report. It was a mountain of proof, each page a testament to her betrayal. I didn't know yet how I would use it, but I knew it would be devastating when I did. Emily had no idea what was coming. She went about her days as though everything was fine, oblivious to the storm brewing just beneath the surface. And as much as it hurt to pretend, I played along. I smiled when she smiled, nodded when she talked, and made sure she suspected nothing. But inside, I was counting down the days, the hours, the minutes. The moment was coming, and when it arrived, she would finally see the truth. Not just about me, but about herself, about the lies she'd built her life on. For now, I waited. The calm before the storm was always the quietest. The waiting was the hardest part. Each day felt like an eternity, but I knew patience would be my greatest weapon. I spent the next week fine-tuning my plan, making sure there were no loose ends, no way for Emily or her accomplices to wriggle out of the consequences. First, I scheduled a meeting with a divorce lawyer. I needed to understand my options, not just for myself, but to ensure I didn't end up blindsided. The lawyer was sympathetic but firm. "With the evidence you've gathered, you're in a strong position," he said, flipping through the file I had brought. "But timing is everything. If you want this to be as clean as possible, wait until after the confrontation to file. You need her reaction documented." I left the office feeling both empowered and nervous. This wasn't just an idea anymore. It was real, and it was happening. That night, I set the final pieces of my plan into motion. I contacted Daniel's boss at the restaurant, sending him an anonymous email with some of the photos and details about Daniel's involvement with a married woman. I didn't hold back, ensuring the message was enough to make waves. Next, I reached out to Eric's wife. It was a difficult decision, but she deserved to know the truth. I sent her a carefully worded message, attaching the damning evidence. My hands shook as I hit send on both emails. There was no going back now. The truth would be unleashed, and the fallout would be inevitable. The day of reckoning arrived on a quiet Saturday. Emily had planned another work outing, which I knew was a thinly veiled excuse to meet Daniel. I waited until she left, then followed her. She didn't go to her usual restaurant this time. Instead, she drove to a nearby park. When I arrived, I saw them sitting on a bench, talking and laughing like they didn't have a care in the world. I parked my car and walked toward them, my heart pounding in my chest. "Emily," I said, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. She froze, her face draining of color. Daniel looked up, confused, but quickly realized who I was. He stood, trying to play it cool, but the fear in his eyes was unmistakable. "We need to talk," I said, staring directly at her. "John, this isn't," she started, but I cut her off. "Save it," I said, holding up my phone. "I've got all the proof I need. Every lie, every meeting, every text. You don't get to explain this away." Her eyes filled with tears, but I didn't flinch. "Daniel, I'd suggest you leave," I added coldly. He hesitated, but when I stepped closer, he bolted like a coward. Emily turned to me, her voice breaking. "John, please, let me explain." "You've already said enough," I replied. "Now it's my turn." We went home in silence. Emily tried to speak a few times, but I shut her down. Once inside, I handed her the folder of evidence. She leafed through it, her hands trembling, her face a mask of guilt and fear. "How long has this been going on?" I demanded. Tears streamed down her face as she confessed everything. It had started with Daniel months ago, a flirtation that turned into something more. Then Eric had entered the picture, offering her something she claimed I couldn't. She painted herself as a victim of her own choices, but I wasn't buying it. "You didn't just betray me," I said, my voice low but firm. "You betrayed yourself. You destroyed everything we built because you were selfish." "I'm so sorry," she sobbed. "I'll do anything to fix this." But I wasn't interested in her apologies. I had other plans. The aftermath was swift. Daniel was fired from the restaurant after his boss received the evidence. Eric's wife confronted him, and their marriage imploded. Meanwhile, Emily's carefully curated image as a devoted wife was shattered. Word spread through our social circles, and she quickly became the subject of whispers and judgment. I filed for divorce the following week, citing infidelity and submitting the evidence as part of the case. Emily begged me to reconsider, but I was done. Her betrayal had cut too deep, and there was no going back. Revenge, I realized, wasn't as sweet as I had imagined. Watching Emily face the consequences of her actions brought some satisfaction, but it didn't erase the pain. Still, there was a sense of closure in knowing I had taken back control. I sold the house and moved into a small apartment, determined to start fresh. Friends and family rallied around me, offering support and reminding me that this was the beginning of a new chapter. Months passed, and the wounds began to heal. Emily tried reaching out a few times, but I blocked her number. I wasn't interested in reopening old wounds. One day, I found myself sitting in a coffee shop, talking to a stranger who made me laugh for the first time in what felt like forever. It wasn't love, Not yet, but it was hope. And for the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe again. Emily's betrayal had broken me, but it hadn't destroyed me. I was still standing, stronger and more determined than ever. This wasn't the end of my story. It was the beginning of a new one.